Thomas Reed owned 15 acres of land in rural Montana that had been his family for 63 years. The Vietnam veteran and former Hells Angel president had built his home there with his own hands back in 1985 after returning from the war. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept himself and helped anyone who needed it. But corporate lawyer Marcus Callahan saw something different when he looked at Thomas's property. He saw prime real estate worth $4 million sitting in the hands of an old biker who probably couldn't read legal documents. Marcus specialized in exploiting loopholes and pressuring landowners to sell, and he'd never lost a case in his 22-year career. He started with friendly offers that Thomas politely declined because the land wasn't for sale at any price. When kindness didn't work, Marcus got creative and filed complaints with the county about zoning violations that didn't exist. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Thomas suddenly faced fines for buildings that had stood for 40 years without issue. Marcus had friends in the county office who owed him favors, and they were happy to help pressure one old biker off his land. The harassment escalated when Marcus discovered an old surveying error from 1961 that placed Thomas's property line 50 feet off from where it actually stood. That small error meant Thomas's house technically sat on land that now belonged to Marcus, who had quietly purchased the adjacent property through a shell company. Marcus filed a lawsuit demanding Thomas vacate the property within 30 days or face criminal trespassing charges. Thomas hired a local attorney named Sarah Chun, who immediately recognized the case as legal theft dressed up in paperwork. She explained that Marcus had done this to 7 other families in Montana, and won every time because he buried them in legal fees until they gave up. Thomas looked at Sarah with tired eyes and told her he'd rather die than leave a land where he'd buried his wife and raised his daughter. Sarah nodded and said she'd fight as hard as she could, but warned him that Marcus had unlimited resources and connections to judges across 3 counties. The hearing was set for February 14th at the Cascade County Courthouse. Marcus arrived in his $200,000 Mercedes, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He walked into that courthouse like he owned it, because in many ways he did after years of donations to judicial campaigns. Thomas arrived on his 1987 Harley wearing his cleanest jeans and his old Hells Angels vest that he hadn't worn in 15 years. Sarah met him on the courthouse steps looking worried because she just learned the judge was Lawrence Brennan, who had ruled in Marcus's favor in 4 previous land cases. Thomas squeezed her shoulder and told her they'd do their best, and whatever happened he wouldn't go quietly. That's when they heard it. The rumble of engines in the distance getting louder and closer with every passing second. Sarah's eyes went wide as the first motorcycles appeared around the corner. The Iron Brotherhood arrived first with 23 riders, followed by the Veterans MC with 31 members. The Road Warriors came next with 18 bikes, and then the Christian riders rolled in with 14 more. Even the Mongols and Banditos showed up together, which never happened because those clubs had been rivals for 40 years. 100 motorcycles filled the courthouse parking lot and spilled onto the street. Thomas stood frozen because he hadn't called anyone or asked for help, but the biker community had heard about Marcus Callahan and decided enough was enough. Big Jake stepped off his bike and walked straight to Thomas. The massive president of the Iron Brotherhood wrapped the old veteran in a bear hug and said, "Brothers don't let brothers fight alone." One by one, the club presidents approached Thomas and shook his hand. These were men who ran separate clubs and normally kept their distance, but today they stood united for one of their own. Marcus watched from his Mercedes with his jaw clenched and his lawyer brain trying to figure out how to spin this in court. He called the police claiming the bikers were intimidating witnesses, but the sheriff who responded was a veteran himself and told Marcus the bikers were peacefully assembled on public property. If you believe bikers protect their own, hit that subscribe button and show your support. The courtroom filled with leather vests and weathered faces that had seen more battles than Marcus could imagine. Judge Brennan walked in expecting a routine hearing, and instead found 100 bikers sitting in perfect silence with their arms crossed. Thomas sat at his table with Sarah while Marcus and his team of 4 lawyers occupied the other side. Judge Brennan banged his gavel and demanded to know why so many unauthorized people were in his courtroom. Big Jake stood slowly and announced they were all character witnesses for Thomas Reed and asked if the judge had a problem with citizens observing public proceedings. The judge's face turned red, but he couldn't legally remove them without cause. Marcus's lead lawyer began his presentation with fancy charts and documents proving the surveying error meant Thomas was technically trespassing on Marcus's property. He spoke for 30 minutes using legal terms designed to confuse and overwhelm. When he finished, Sarah stood with a single folder and told a much simpler story. She explained that Marcus had purchased the adjacent land specifically to exploit the 63-year-old surveying error, and that he'd done the same scheme to 7 other Montana families. She presented evidence that Marcus had bribed a county surveyor to hide updated documents that would have corrected the property line years ago. The judge interrupted and accused Sarah of making serious allegations without proof. Snake, a 68-year-old Vietnam vet with 3 Purple Hearts, stood up and said he had proof. He explained he'd been a county surveyor from 1995 to 2010, and Marcus had offered him $50,000 to lose certain documents. He'd refused and been fired under mysterious circumstances, but kept copies of everything. Snake walked forward and handed Judge Brennan a thick envelope containing 15 years of correspondence between Marcus and various county officials. The judge's face went pale as he read through emails discussing how to pressure landowners and exploit legal loopholes. Marcus jumped up screaming that this was entrapment and illegal evidence gathering. Big Jake smiled and reminded everyone that recording conversations with lawyers isn't illegal in Montana when discussing potential crimes. Suddenly another biker stood up and identified himself as retired FBI agent Robert Torres. He explained the Bureau had been investigating Marcus for land fraud for 18 months, and this case gave them exactly what they needed. Marcus's face drained of all color as Agent Torres casually mentioned the 4 federal agents waiting outside to arrest him. Judge Brennan cleared his throat and announced he was dismissing the case immediately and ordering a full investigation into the original surveying error. He declared Thomas's property line would be corrected to reflect the original 1961 survey, plus damages for the harassment he'd endured. Marcus tried to leave, but federal agents entered the courtroom and placed him under arrest for fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. His expensive lawyers suddenly remembered other appointments and practically ran from the courtroom, leaving Marcus to face justice alone. Thomas sat in stunned silence as 100 bikers erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah hugged him with tears streaming down her face because she'd never won against Marcus Callahan until today. Outside the courthouse, Thomas stood surrounded by 100 bikers who'd save his home without being asked. He tried to thank them, but Big Jake stopped him and said that's what family does. The bikers had brought food and beer and turned the courthouse parking lot into an impromptu celebration. Thomas's daughter drove up with his 3 grandchildren who'd heard their grandpa was in trouble. She cried when she realized 100 strangers had come to protect her father's land and legacy. Marcus Callahan was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to return land to all 7 families he defrauded. His law license was revoked and his assets were seized to pay restitution. The surveying error was officially corrected and Thomas received $400,000 in damages for the harassment he'd endured. He used that money to start a legal defense fund for landowners facing similar predatory tactics. 2 years later, Thomas's property became the site of an annual biker rally that raises money for veterans facing legal battles. Over 500 bikers show up every year to celebrate the day 100 motorcycles prove that corporate lawyers aren't invincible when they mess with the wrong people. Thomas still lives on his 15 acres, and every morning he walks to the spot where his wife is buried and thanks her for giving him the strength to fight. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in standing up to bullies no matter how expensive their suits are.